Very good afternoon everyone. Today we are going to start a new chapter in the second year. If you remember, in the first year in plant kingdom we have discussed about algae, bryophyta, pteridophyta and gymnosperms. There we didn't discuss much about angiosperms because they deserve a separate chapter. So today we are going to study about that topic, sexual reproduction in flowering plants. So let's start the class. Reproduction. What is reproduction? Biological process where a parent produces offspring. So if we take animals, do they reproduce? Yes. Or if we take plants, do they reproduce? Yes. And microorganisms? Of course, even they do. So all the organisms, all the living organisms, they do reproduce except few organisms. Imagine if there is no reproduction at all. What if there is no reproduction? Every reproduction has stopped. What will happen? There will be no new life. No new life will be formed. So what will happen now? The older organisms will stay. For how long they will stay? At one point of time, even they will disappear. Then, no life on earth. This is the reason why reproduction is one of the most important characteristics of living organisms. If there is no reproduction, there won't be any life on earth. Just remember this. And coming to types of reproductions, there are two kinds of reproductions. One is asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Our topic is about sexual reproduction, but we must also know about what is asexual reproduction. We have seen this in first year. What is asexual reproduction? Here the fusion of gametes doesn't take place. A biological process where fusion of gametes doesn't take place and involves only one male. A type of reproduction where the fusion of gametes doesn't take place and it involves only one male is known as asexual reproduction. Examples. So if you remember, in the first year we have discussed about binary fission. Binary fission. Binary means two. Fission means to divide. A single parent divides into two daughter cells. This can be seen in bacteria. And budding. Budding means an outgrowth. And it's like a pimple. An outgrowth from a plant body or an organism which grows outside, and whenever the bud detaches from the parent organism, it grows into a new organism. This can be seen in hydra. And fragmentation. So here the parent part, it breaks from the parent part and it divides into, and it becomes a new organism. This can be seen in planaria. And there is one more, vegetative reproduction. Vegetative propagation. So in morphology, we have discussed about underground stem, adaptations of underground stem. There we have studied about tuber, rhizome, which happens through vegetative parts like stem, root or leaves is known as vegetative propagation. And coming to benefits of asexual reproduction, this is energy efficient. It doesn't require much energy. And as I told you, it requires only one mate. And it doesn't take much time. Less time consuming. And the offsprings will be more in number. More offsprings. That's it. That's the thing about asexual reproduction. Now let's discuss about sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction, biological process of reproduction where fusion of gametes takes place. Fusion of gametes. Here two mates are required. Two gametes are required. And it's a very complex process. First, gametogenesis, where the gametes are formed, and then we'll see the fusion of gametes, fertilization, and then we'll see the post-fertilization events like formation of zygote, embryo, etc. This is a very complex process, but sexual reproduction is one of the most easiest processes. But 99.9% of the living organism, means 99% of the much complex eukaryotes, they prefer sexual reproduction. Why? Why? So you might ask me, sir, you are saying that asexual reproduction is an energy efficient, it doesn't require much energy and it requires less time and it requires only one mate. But coming to sexual reproduction, it requires two mates and it's a very big process, and even the offspring number is very less. But still, why 99.9% of the organisms prefer sexual reproduction? Because variation. Variation. Here, we cannot see any variation in asexual reproduction. But here, we can see variation. Because here, only single mate is involved. And the mate and the offspring are almost identical. Not almost, completely identical. But here, if you take sexual reproduction, two different organisms are involving in reproduction. So obviously the offspring will have a difference between their parents. So if there is no variation in apes, I think there would be no humans who are evolved. That's the reason why variation is important for evolution and survival. That's the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction. This is the reason why plants or human beings or all the much developed complex eukaryotes prefer sexual reproduction. So I'll come in a minute with a diagram. These are the green ones are sepals. Petals. Both sepals and petals are non-essential worms because these are sterile in nature. They do give protection, but they are not involved in reproduction. And stamen is the male reproductive part and this pistil is a female reproductive part. We'll discuss them in detail now. So let's start with male reproductive part, stem. microfilm. Stamen. Stem, which is also known as microfilm. Consists of two parts. One is anther and filament. Filament is a long, slender part which attaches the anther to the thallus or the petal. And the main important part, anther. So, anther is present terminally and it has two lobes. Bilobed anther is present. And each lobe has two chambers. That's the reason why it is known as dithecus. So, these are bilobed structures. So, it's like this. It is connected by a connective tissue and these are dithecus. Each lobe has two chambers in it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Total how many chambers? 4 chambers. 4 chambers. Which are filled with microsporangia. So, the stamen, the male reproductive organ, which has a filament which connects the anther to the petal or thallus, and the anther, which is present terminally in the top, which is bilobed in structure. It has two lobes in it, and it is dithecus because each lobe has two theca in it, and it has 4 chambers. Total 4 chambers are present with microsporangia. So, coming to the layers. So, this is the tiers of anther. Tiers of anther. Tiers of anther. So, the outermost layer is known as epidermis. It is a single layer, and the innermost layer of epidermis is known as endothelium, and the innermost layer for the endothelium is middle layers. So, epidermis is only one layer, and endothelium is also only one layer, but middle layers 2 to 3 layers are present with parenchymatous cells. All these 3 are helpful in protection and dehiscence. Dehiscence of pollen grains means release of pollen grain. So, all these three layers, epidermis, endothelium and middle layers, all are helpful in protection and dehiscence. But there is one more layer called as tapetum. This layer is also single. This helps in nourishment. It supplies nutrients and food materials to the inner cells. So, this is the tiers of anther. It has 4 different layers. 4 different layers. One is epidermis, which is a single layer, and endothelium, which is also a single layer, and middle layers, which are 2 to 3 in layers, which are made up of parenchymatous cells. All these cells all these layers are helpful in protection and dehiscence of pollen grains. But there is one more layer called tapetum, which is also one layer which helps in nourishment, which gives the food materials and nutrients to the inner cells. So this is it. Both the anther. And now we have spoke about microsporangia. The microsporangia is present inside. So there is inside the microsporangia, when the anther is thin, sporangious tissue is formed, which is a homologous tissue which is formed in the young anther. And this porogenous tissue becomes matured, becomes spore mother cell, which is diploid in nature. And this spore mother cell undergoes meiosis and becomes a tetrad of microspores. This tetrad is covered by a layer called callose, which is secreted by tapetum. So, the young anther, inside the microsporangia, sporogenous tissue, a homologous tissue called sporogenous tissue is formed, and this becomes matured and it forms spore mother cell, which is also diploid in nature. And this spore mother cell, which is diploid in nature, it undergoes meiosis and becomes tetrad of microspores, which is haploid in nature. Right? And this tetrad of microspores, they get matured and becomes pollen grains. Sporogenous tissue, when becomes mature, it becomes spore mother cell, which is diploid in nature, and it undergoes meiosis and it becomes tetrad of microspores. 4 cells are present, and this becomes mature and it becomes pollen grains. And this pollen grains, they again get matured and they become root cells, vegetative cell, and generative cell. So this vegetative cell is a big cell with big nucleus and irregular nucleus. And this generative cell is a small and spindle-shaped nucleus. And this cell floats in vegetative cell because it is a very small cell. And the main function of vegetative cell is to give nourishment to this generative cell. After some time, so this vegetative cell, it becomes disappeared, and the only generative cell is present. This generative cell becomes into 2 main gametes. pollen grains are formed from tetrad of microscopes, and these pollen grains become mature, and the pollen grain, not grains, a pollen grain becomes divided into two groups: vegetative cell and generative cell. Generative cell is a very small cell, and the vegetative cell is a much bigger cell. It has a big big cytoplasm and irregular nucleus, and this generative cell floats in the vegetative cell, right? And then this disappears, and the only generative cell is present. This generative cell becomes into two male gametes. In 60% of the cells, in 60% of the cases, in 60% of the sexually reproductive plants, this thing happens before going into before pollen grain reaches into the stigma. But what about the remaining 40% of the cells? Remaining 40% of the cells, this generative cell, it becomes into two male gametes and one vegetative cell. So this vegetative cell, this is helpful when the pollen grain falls on stigma. It produces a pollen tube. The pollen tube will come from vegetative cell. So in 60% of the organisms, like in 60% of the sexually reproducing flowering plants, the stage stops at two male gametes. But in 40% of the remaining 40%, they have two male gametes and one vegetative cell. This vegetative cell helps in when the pollen grain falls on stigma, and this vegetative cell becomes into pollen tube, and it reaches the ovule or ovary. So what about the 60%? You said the 40% will have two male gametes and one vegetative cell, and that vegetative cell is useful in producing pollen tube. What about this 60%? How will they give the pollen tube? When these two male gametes, the pollen grain falls on the stigma, then they will produce the vegetative cell. Till then, they will stay in two male gamete stage. Understood? I will explain it clearly. So, I hope you understood clearly till here. So, in 60% of the plants which reproduce sexually, they become two male gametes. They stop at this stage. And after this pollen grain reaches onto the stigma of a female flower, then these two male gametes will become they will have an extra vegetative cell, and that vegetative cell helps in producing pollen tube. But 40%, remaining 40%, the two male gametes and one vegetative cell is already formed here. Understood? That's it. And coming to pollen grain structure. The outermost layer is made up of sporopollen. Inside, which is made up of sporopollen. The innermost layer is known as intine, which is made up of cellulose and pectin. This sporopollen is one of the most important enzyme or the chemical which cannot be degraded with any kind of enzyme or chemical. There is no chemical or enzyme that can degrade this sporopollen. So how can the content present inside the pollen grain comes out. There are some pores in the sporopollen. Pores. These are known as germ pores. These germ pores are helpful in producing pollen tube and also nourishment. So this is pollen grain. The outermost layer is made up of egg sac and the innermost layer is known as intine. The egg sac is made up of sporopollen and the intine is made up of cellulose and pectin. The sporopollen is one of the most important enzyme or the chemical which cannot be degraded with any kind of chemical or enzyme which is present on the earth. It's impossible to degrade it. Then how can this part which is present inside comes out or like air passes through it? Because they have a spores called germ pores. They help in giving the pollen tube or exchange of gases and all the other things. So that's it about the male reproductive part, and next class we'll discuss about the female reproductive